The morning of July 10, 1944, arrived in the Courland Peninsula with the deceptive tranquility that often preceded catastrophe. Major Heinrich Bauer of the 16th Army stood in the forward command post near Tukums, studying reconnaissance reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture of German positions throughout Latvia. Behind him, the operational maps that covered every wall of the bunker told a story that no amount of tactical skill could rewrite. The red arrows marking Soviet advances had multiplied overnight, each one representing another breakthrough by the Leningrad Front as Stalin's summer offensive gained momentum across the Baltic states. The Wehrmacht's Army Group North, once the spearhead of Operation Barbarossa's northern thrust, now found itself compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter that stretched from the outskirts of Riga to the frozen shores of the Baltic Sea. Bauer had served with the 16th Army since the opening days of the Russian campaign, watching the division evolve from a confident instrument of conquest into a desperate collection of understrength units fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The reconnaissance battalion he commanded had once ranged deep into Soviet territory, gathering intelligence on enemy positions and disrupting supply lines with the aggressive confidence that characterized German tactical doctrine. Now his men spent their days identifying escape routes and calculating how long their remaining ammunition would last against the endless waves of Soviet infantry that seemed to emerge from the Estonian forests like a plague of locusts. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable, each tactical withdrawal eroding not just territory but the psychological foundation that had sustained the Wehrmacht through 3 years of brutal warfare. The intelligence briefing that Captain Ernst Müller delivered at 0800 hours confirmed what every man in the forward command post had suspected but hoped was merely pessimistic speculation. The Soviet Second Shock Army had broken through German defensive lines near Ostrov, advancing at a rate that would bring them to the outskirts of Riga within 72 hours. Simultaneously, the Leningrad Front had launched coordinated attacks along the entire length of Army Group North's positions, stretching German reserves beyond their breaking point and making tactical reinforcement impossible. The mathematical reality was stark and unforgiving. The Wehrmacht forces in the Baltic states were outnumbered 4-1 in infantry, 6-1 in artillery, and 12-1 in armored vehicles. Even more critically, Soviet air superiority had reached the point where German supply convoys could only move at night, and even then only with significant losses to enemy fighter bombers. Captain Müller spread the latest aerial reconnaissance photographs across the map table with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to find meaning in the stark black and white images that defined modern warfare. Each photograph told part of the larger story of collapse and encirclement that was unfolding across the Baltic region. Soviet tank columns stretched for miles along the primary roads leading toward Riga, their T-34 tanks and self-propelled artillery advancing with the mechanical precision that characterized Red Army operations in the 4th year of the war. Behind the armored spearheads, endless columns of infantry marched through the Lithuanian countryside, their numbers so vast that they appeared as dark rivers flowing across the landscape toward the German defensive positions. The Soviets have committed at least 6 rifle divisions to the offensive against our positions near Jelgava, Müller reported, his voice carrying the flat professional tone that had become standard among German officers when discussing tactical disasters. Reconnaissance battalion reports indicate that enemy forces are advancing in regimental strength along multiple axes, supported by heavy artillery and close air support. Our defensive positions have been breached in at least 3 locations, and tactical withdrawal has become necessary to prevent encirclement of forward elements. The captain paused to indicate specific positions on the map, each red marking representing another tactical failure in what had become an unbroken string of German defeats since the collapse of Army Group Center during Operation Barbarossa. Major Bauer studied the reconnaissance photographs with the analytical detachment that had kept him alive through 3 years of warfare on the Eastern Front. The images revealed not just the immediate tactical situation but the broader strategic reality that German high command seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge. The Soviet Union had transformed itself from the disorganized victim of 1941 into a military-industrial colossus capable of sustaining offensive operations on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Red Army that now advanced toward Riga bore little resemblance to the poorly equipped and badly led force that had retreated in confusion during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. These were veteran troops led by experienced commanders who had learned their trade in the crucible of Stalingrad and Kursk, supported by artillery and armor that matched or exceeded German equipment in both quantity and quality. The strategic implications of the current offensive extended far beyond the immediate threat to Army Group North. The Soviet breakthrough in the Baltic states was part of a coordinated summer campaign designed to destroy German forces in the east, while the Western Allies consolidated their positions in Normandy and prepared for the drive toward Paris. Stalin's generals had learned to coordinate their operations with mathematical precision, timing their attacks to maximize German difficulties and prevent effective reinforcement between threatened sectors. The Wehrmacht now faced the nightmare scenario that German strategic planners had sought to avoid since 1939. Simultaneous major offensives on multiple fronts that exceeded Germany's capacity to respond effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Franz Dietrich arrived at the forward command post at 0845 hours. His field gray uniform bearing the dust and grime that marked him as a combat officer rather than a staff functionary. Dietrich commanded the remnants of what had once been a full infantry regiment, reduced through casualties and strategic withdrawals to approximately battalion strength. His men represented the backbone of German defensive efforts in this sector, veteran soldiers who had learned to fight with the desperate efficiency that came from understanding that defeat meant death or capture by an enemy that showed little mercy to Wehrmacht prisoners. The colonel's assessment of the tactical situation was delivered with the brutal honesty that characterized German military culture at its best. "We can hold current positions for perhaps 48 hours against determined assault," Dietrich reported, spreading his own tactical maps across the table to supplement the aerial reconnaissance photographs. "Infantry strength is down to 60% of authorized levels, and ammunition reserves are sufficient for one major engagement. Artillery support is limited to emergency fire missions only. As the guns are being conserved for the evacuation of Riga," the colonel's finger traced the defensive lines that his regiment had prepared during the previous weeks, positions that had been designed to delay rather than defeat a Soviet advance. "The men understand the situation. They're prepared to fight, but they also understand that we're buying time rather than seeking tactical victory." The reality that no one in the forward command post was willing to articulate directly was that Army Group North had become strategically irrelevant to German war plans. The Wehrmacht High Command was focused on defending the Reich itself, concentrating available reserves for the defense of East Prussia and the approaches to Berlin. The forces trapped in the Baltic states represented approximately 200,000 men who could not be evacuated and could not be reinforced, a mathematical equation that reduced them to expendable assets in the larger calculation of national survival. Their mission had evolved from tactical offense to strategic delay, fighting to prevent Soviet forces from being transferred to more critical fronts, while the Wehrmacht prepared its final defensive positions along the borders of Germany itself. Major Bauer found himself thinking about the evolution of warfare as he studied the intelligence reports that continued to arrive throughout the morning. The conflict that had begun with the confident mobility of blitzkrieg had devolved into the grinding attrition that characterized warfare between industrialized nations. The tactical innovations that had carried German forces to the gates of Moscow and Leningrad were now being used against them by an enemy who had learned to combine Soviet manpower with American industrial capacity and British strategic intelligence. The Wehrmacht faced not just the Red Army but the combined military-industrial capacity of three major powers, a mathematical impossibility that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The first Soviet artillery barrage of the day began at 1030 hours, the distinctive whistle of Katyusha rockets providing 30 seconds of warning before the explosions began walking across the German positions with methodical precision. The barrage was being directed by forward observers who had obviously studied the Wehrmacht defensive positions with care, as the rounds fell with devastating accuracy among the communication trenches and command bunkers that formed the backbone of German tactical organization. Mixed with the rocket artillery were rounds from conventional guns, creating a symphony of destruction that had become the signature of Soviet offensive operations. The bombardment continued for 25 minutes, long enough to disrupt communications and demoralize defenders, but not so long as to waste ammunition that would be needed for the infantry assault that was certain to follow. During the height of the artillery fire, Bauer found himself pressed against the reinforced walls of the command bunker, listening to the crash of explosions overhead while calculating the tactical implications of what he was experiencing. This level of artillery preparation indicated that the Soviets were preparing for a major assault, probably with at least regimental strength supported by armor and close air support. The coordination between different artillery systems demonstrated the professional competence that now characterized Red Army operations, a far cry from the disorganized attacks that had characterized Soviet tactical doctrine during the early years of the war. The Wehrmacht was facing an enemy that had learned to fight with German efficiency, while retaining the numerical advantages that had always been the Soviet Union's greatest military asset. The artillery fire lifted at 1,055 hours, and the expected Soviet assault began immediately with the mechanical precision that characterized Red Army tactical doctrine. T-34 tanks emerged from the forests east of Tukums in company strength, their 76 mm guns engaging German positions while supporting infantry advanced through the communication trenches that connected the Wehrmacht defensive positions. The attack was being conducted by what appeared to be a full rifle regiment of the 2nd Shock Army, veteran troops whose tactical movement demonstrated the training and experience that had been purchased with 3 years of brutal warfare. The coordination between armor, artillery, and infantry was flawless, each element supporting the others in a combined arms assault that represented the evolution of Soviet military doctrine from the desperate improvisations of 1941 to the professional competence of 1944. Bauer watched the attack develop through the periscope of his command bunker, noting with professional detachment the tactical skill that the Soviet forces displayed as they advanced through the German defensive obstacles. The Red Army troops moved with the confidence of soldiers who had learned their trade in the crucible of Stalingrad and Kursk, using terrain and suppressive fire to minimize casualties while maintaining steady pressure on the Wehrmacht positions. Their equipment was no longer the improvised mixture of Soviet, British, and American weapons that had characterized Red Army units earlier in the war. These soldiers carried standardized Soviet weapons, wore uniforms that had been manufactured in quantity sufficient to equip millions of men, and fought with the tactical doctrine that had been refined through dozens of major operations against the Wehrmacht. The German response to the Soviet assault demonstrated both the tactical competence and the material limitations that now characterized Wehrmacht operations in the Baltic states. The infantry regiment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich fought with the disciplined efficiency that had made German forces the most feared opponents in Europe, but their defensive fire lacked the weight and sustainability that had once characterized Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. Ammunition shortages forced German gunners to choose their targets carefully, engaging only the most threatening Soviet vehicles while conserving rounds for the infantry assault that would follow the elimination of German armor. The tactical situation had evolved to the point where German forces were fighting a defensive battle with offensive limitations, unable to sustain the rate of fire necessary to break up concentrated enemy attacks. The breakthrough came at 1,134 hours when Soviet combat engineers succeeded in eliminating the anti-tank obstacles that protected the northern approach to the German positions. A company of T-34 tanks exploited the gap immediately, advancing into the Wehrmacht defensive perimeter while supporting infantry followed closely behind the armor. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as German anti-tank guns were overwhelmed by the number of targets, and Soviet infantry began clearing individual fighting positions with grenades and submachine guns. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich's regiment fought with desperate courage, but the mathematical reality was inescapable. The Wehrmacht forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on the ammunition necessary to sustain defensive operations against determined assault. Major Bauer made the tactical decision to authorize a fighting withdrawal at 1,147 hours, understanding that preserving his remaining forces was more important than holding ground that could not be defended indefinitely. The withdrawal was conducted with the professional competence that characterized German military operations even under the most adverse circumstances, each unit covering the movement of the next while maintaining tactical cohesion and fire discipline. The reconnaissance battalion led the movement, using their superior knowledge of local terrain to identify routes that would minimize casualties from Soviet artillery and air attack. Behind them, the infantry regiment conducted a series of delaying actions designed to slow the Soviet advance and prevent the development of a full-scale pursuit. The strategic reality that became clear during the afternoon of July 10th was that the German defensive line in central Latvia had collapsed irretrievably. Soviet forces had achieved breakthrough in multiple sectors, and Wehrmacht reserves were insufficient to seal the gaps or restore tactical coherence to the front. Radio communications with Army Group North headquarters in Riga confirmed that similar tactical disasters were occurring throughout the Baltic states, with German forces in retreat along the entire length of their defensive positions. The carefully planned withdrawal to the Courland Peninsula was beginning 3 weeks ahead of schedule, transforming what was supposed to be a deliberate redeployment into a desperate flight toward defensive positions that might not exist when the retreating forces arrived. The human cost of the strategic collapse became apparent as Bauer's command group established a temporary headquarters in the village of Kuldiga, 25 kilometers west of their original positions. Casualty reports from subordinate units painted a picture of tactical disaster that could not be concealed by euphemistic language about strategic redeployments and tactical adjustments. The reconnaissance battalion had lost approximately 30% of its strength during the withdrawal, including 2 company commanders who had been killed by Soviet artillery fire while attempting to establish rearguard positions. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich's infantry regiment was reduced to approximately company strength, the survivors showing the hollow-eyed exhaustion that marked troops who had been pushed beyond their physical and psychological limits. The logistical situation was even more desperate than the tactical circumstances. German supply lines had been severed by the Soviet breakthrough, leaving Wehrmacht forces dependent on emergency stockpiles that had been established for exactly this contingency. Ammunition was strictly rationed, with each soldier authorized to carry only basic combat loads that would be sufficient for one major engagement. Medical supplies were virtually exhausted, forcing German medical personnel to make the brutal decisions about which wounded soldiers could be treated and which would be left to die or capture by advancing Soviet forces. Food was limited to emergency rations, supplemented by whatever could be requisitioned from local Estonian and Latvian civilians who were themselves facing starvation as the war devastated their homeland. The arrival of Oberstleutnant Kurt Steiner at 1,630 hours brought confirmation of the strategic disaster that had overtaken German forces throughout the Baltic region. Steiner served as operations officer for the 14 Panzer Corps, one of the elite formations that had spearheaded the original German advance into the Soviet Union and which now found itself fighting for survival in a tactical environment that bore no resemblance to the confident offensive operations of 1941. His assessment of the strategic situation was delivered with the clinical precision that characterized German staff officers, but the content of his briefing represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of the war itself. Army Group North has received authorization for immediate withdrawal to the Courland Peninsula, Steiner announced, his words carrying implications that every officer in the room understood without elaboration. The Courland Peninsula represented the final defensive position available to German forces in the Baltic states, a geographic cul-de-sac that could be defended but from which evacuation would be virtually impossible once Soviet forces completed their encirclement. All units are to conduct fighting withdrawals to designated assembly areas, preserving combat strength for final defensive operations. Naval evacuation is being coordinated by Kriegsmarine elements, but capacity is limited and priority will be given to specialized personnel and critical equipment. The mathematical reality underlying Steiner's briefing was stark and unforgiving. Army Group North consisted of approximately 200,000 men organized into multiple corps and divisions, but the Kriegsmarine possessed neither the shipping nor the time necessary to evacuate forces of that magnitude under combat conditions. The Baltic Sea had become a Soviet lake, patrolled by submarines and surface vessels that would make evacuation operations prohibitively expensive in terms of men and material. Even under the most optimistic circumstances, the Wehrmacht could hope to evacuate perhaps 50,000 men before Soviet forces completed their encirclement of the Courland Peninsula. The remainder would fight until their ammunition was exhausted, then face death or capture by an enemy that had little reason to show mercy to troops who had participated in the systematic devastation of the Soviet Union. Major Bauer found himself thinking about the evolution of his own tactical philosophy as he studied the operational maps that Steiner had brought from Corps headquarters. 3 years earlier, he had been a confident young officer convinced that German military superiority would ensure rapid victory over the Soviet Union. The tactical successes of the opening months had seemed to confirm the validity of Wehrmacht doctrine and the inherent advantages of German military culture. Now he understood that those early victories had been achieved against an enemy that was learning to fight even as it retreated, acquiring the tactical knowledge and industrial capacity that would eventually turn the tide of the war. The Red Army that now advanced toward the Courland Peninsula was not the same force that had fled in confusion during the opening days of Operation Barbarossa. The strategic implications of the German retreat extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Baltic states. The collapse of Army Group North represented the failure of Hitler's fundamental strategic assumption that the Soviet Union could be defeated through rapid offensive operations that would destroy the Red Army before Soviet industry, could be fully mobilized for war. Instead, the Wehrmacht had become trapped in a war of attrition against an enemy whose capacity to sustain casualties and replace equipment far exceeded German capabilities. The tactical excellence that had carried German forces to the gates of Moscow and Leningrad was no longer sufficient to overcome the material disadvantages that had accumulated through 3 years of strategic miscalculation. The village of Kuldiga, which served as the temporary headquarters for Major Bauer's scattered command, provided a microcosm of the human cost that the war had inflicted on the civilian population of the Baltic states. The Estonian and Latvian civilians who remained in the area bore the hollow-eyed appearance of people who had endured years of occupation, requisition, and the brutal mathematics of total war. Many had initially welcomed German forces as liberators from Soviet occupation, but 3 years of Wehrmacht administration had demonstrated that Nazi racial ideology offered little improvement over Stalinist tyranny. Now they faced the return of Soviet rule with the knowledge that collaboration with German forces would be punished with deportation to the Gulag or summary execution. The psychological impact of strategic defeat was becoming apparent among German forces as the reality of encirclement sank in among officers and enlisted men alike. The confidence and aggressive spirit that had characterized Wehrmacht tactical doctrine was being replaced by the defensive mentality of troops who understood that they were fighting for survival rather than victory. Morale remained high among veteran units like Bauer's Reconnaissance Battalion, but the foundation of that morale had shifted from expectation of success to professional pride in competent performance under impossible circumstances. The soldiers of Army Group North were learning to find meaning in tactical excellence rather than strategic achievement, a psychological transformation that marked the evolution from victorious army to desperate last stand. Captain Mueller's reconnaissance patrols, dispatched during the early evening hours to assess Soviet dispositions and identify potential escape routes, returned with information that confirmed the worst fears of German tactical planners. The Red Army was advancing on multiple axes with the methodical precision that characterized Soviet offensive operations, establishing blocking positions that would prevent German withdrawal while maintaining pressure that made static defense impossible. The reconnaissance battalion reported Soviet forces in regimental strength advancing along the primary roads toward Liepāja and Ventspils, the 2 major ports through which any maritime evacuation would have to be conducted. Simultaneously, Soviet armored spearheads were pushing toward Riga itself, threatening to sever the land communications that connected German forces scattered throughout Latvia and Estonia. The tactical situation that developed during the night of July 10th to 11th represented a classic military encirclement, with German forces trapped between advancing Soviet armies and the Baltic Sea. Wehrmacht units that had spent 3 years advancing eastward across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory now found themselves compressed into an area roughly the size of Connecticut, fighting with their backs to the sea against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing day. The irony was not lost on German officers who remembered the confident predictions of 1941, when Nazi strategists had calculated that the Soviet Union would collapse within months of the German invasion. Now those same strategists faced the mathematical reality that Germany itself might not survive another winter of warfare against the combined might of the Allied coalition. The morning of July 11th brought confirmation that the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of restoration. Radio communications with German forces throughout the Baltic states painted a picture of coordinated collapse that extended from Estonia to Lithuania. The Wehrmacht's Army Group North was disintegrating as a coherent military formation, its constituent units fighting individual battles for survival while Soviet forces tightened the noose around the Courland Peninsula. The 14th Panzer Corps, once the spearhead of German offensive operations in the Baltic region, was conducting a fighting withdrawal through terrain that favored defense but which could not be held indefinitely against superior numbers and overwhelming firepower. Major Bauer's Reconnaissance Battalion, reduced to approximately company strength through casualties and strategic withdrawals, established new positions in the forests west of Kuldiga as Soviet forces continued their advance toward the Courland Peninsula. The tactical environment had become a nightmare of confused small unit actions, with German forces attempting to maintain tactical cohesion while conducting withdrawals through terrain that channeled movement and provided excellent observation for Soviet artillery. The Wehrmacht soldiers who had once advanced with confident precision through these same forests now found themselves fighting a series of desperate rearguard actions against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited reserves of men and material. The human dimension of the strategic collapse became apparent as German medical personnel attempted to care for the wounded while maintaining the mobility necessary for continued withdrawal. Field hospitals were repeatedly overrun by Soviet advances, forcing medical officers to make the brutal decision to abandon patients who could not be moved. The wounded who could travel were loaded onto the few remaining vehicles, but vehicle maintenance had become virtually impossible due to lack of spare parts and fuel shortages that limited movement to essential operations only. Many wounded German soldiers chose to remain at their posts rather than burden their units with casualties who could not contribute to tactical operations, a decision that reflected both the desperate nature of the situation and the professional ethos that continued to motivate Wehrmacht personnel even under the most adverse circumstances. The psychological transformation that overtook German forces during the retreat to the Courland Peninsula represented more than simple demoralization in the face of tactical defeat. The officers and men of Army Group North were experiencing the cognitive dissonance that came from recognizing that everything they had been taught about German military superiority was fundamentally incorrect. The tactical excellence that had been drilled into them during peacetime training remained intact, but the strategic framework within which that tactical competence operated had collapsed completely. They were professional soldiers fighting a professional campaign for a cause that they were beginning to understand was doomed from the outset. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich's assessment of German tactical capabilities, delivered during a commander's conference on the evening of July 11th, reflected the brutal honesty that characterized Wehrmacht leadership at its best. "We can continue to fight effectively at the tactical level for the foreseeable future," he reported, his voice carrying the flat professionalism that had become standard among German officers when discussing military disasters. "Infantry morale remains high, and tactical leadership continues to function effectively under combat conditions. However, strategic mobility is virtually non-existent, ammunition reserves are critically low, and reinforcement is impossible under current circumstances. We are conducting tactical operations within a strategic framework that no longer exists." The logistical mathematics that governed German operations in the Courland Peninsula were simple and unforgiving. Army Group North required approximately 500 tons of supplies per day to maintain basic combat effectiveness, but the Wehrmacht possessed neither the transportation capacity nor the secure supply lines necessary to deliver material in such quantities. The Baltic Sea had become a Soviet-controlled waterway, patrolled by submarines and surface vessels that made maritime supply operations prohibitively dangerous. Air transport was limited to emergency evacuation of critical personnel and could not provide the bulk supplies necessary to sustain military operations. The German forces trapped in the Courland Peninsula were fighting on borrowed time, consuming stockpiles that could not be replaced while facing an enemy whose supply lines stretched uninterrupted back to the industrial centers of the Soviet Union. The arrival of Oberst Wilhelm Hoffmann at 0200 hours on July 12 brought the final confirmation of strategic disaster that German tactical commanders had anticipated but hoped to avoid. Hoffmann served as Chief of Staff for Army Group North, a position that provided him with access to the highest levels of German strategic planning and the most accurate assessments of Wehrmacht capabilities. His midnight briefing was delivered to an audience of field-grade officers who understood that they were receiving information that would determine whether their units survived the next 72 hours or were destroyed in the tactical chaos that had engulfed German forces throughout the Baltic region. Effective immediately, all German forces in the Baltic states are authorized to conduct withdrawals to the Courland Peninsula, Hoffmann announced, his words carrying the weight of strategic decision-making at the highest levels of German command. Naval evacuation operations will commence within 48 hours, but shipping capacity is severely limited and priority will be given to personnel whose specialized knowledge is considered essential to continued resistance. All other personnel are directed to establish defensive positions and conduct operations designed to delay Soviet advances while evacuation proceeds. The operational implications of Hoffmann's briefing were clear to every officer in the room. The vast majority of German forces in the Baltic states would not be evacuated, but would fight until their ammunition was exhausted and then face capture or death at the hands of Soviet forces. The mathematical reality underlying German strategy in the Courland Peninsula was that Army Group North had become expendable in the larger calculation of national survival. Hitler and his strategic advisors were concentrated on defending the Reich itself, preserving resources for the defense of East Prussia and the approaches to Berlin. The 200,000 German soldiers trapped in the Baltic states represented a substantial military force, but they could neither be reinforced nor evacuated in sufficient numbers to justify diverting resources from more critical theaters. Their mission had evolved from tactical offense to strategic sacrifice, fighting to prevent Soviet forces from being transferred to other fronts, while the Wehrmacht prepared its final defensive positions along the borders of Germany proper. Major Bauer found himself thinking about the nature of military duty as he received orders to establish reconnaissance positions along the perimeter of what would become known as the Courland Pocket. The professional oath that every German officer had sworn required obedience to legitimate military authority and dedication to the defense of the fatherland, but the current strategic situation raised fundamental questions about the relationship between tactical competence and strategic wisdom. He remained convinced that his soldiers deserved leadership that would preserve their lives whenever possible while accomplishing missions that contributed to meaningful military objectives. The challenge was determining which missions retained strategic value when the larger war effort had clearly failed. The reconnaissance patrols that Captain Müller organized during the early morning hours of July 12 confirmed that Soviet forces were establishing the encirclement that would trap German forces in the Courland Peninsula for the remainder of the war. Red Army units in division strength were advancing toward Liepaja and Ventspils, the two major ports through which any significant maritime evacuation would have to be conducted. Simultaneously, Soviet armored forces were pushing toward the narrow land corridor that connected the Courland Peninsula to the rest of Latvia, threatening to complete the encirclement that would transform Army Group North from a mobile military formation into a besieged garrison fighting for survival in an increasingly restricted perimeter. The tactical excellence that German forces continued to demonstrate even under desperate circumstances was evident in the fighting withdrawals that characterized Wehrmacht operations during the retreat to the Courland Peninsula. Individual units fought with the disciplined competence that had made the Wehrmacht the most feared military force in Europe, conducting tactical operations that inflicted disproportionate casualties on advancing Soviet forces while preserving their own combat effectiveness for continued resistance. The reconnaissance battalion under Bauer's command demonstrated particular skill in identifying Soviet weaknesses and exploiting them through limited counterattacks that disrupted enemy timetables and preserved tactical momentum despite strategic disadvantage. The human cost of professional military excellence under hopeless strategic circumstances became apparent as German casualties mounted during the fighting withdrawal to the Courland Peninsula. Veterans who had survived 3 years of warfare on the Eastern Front were killed or wounded in tactical actions that could only delay rather than prevent ultimate defeat. The loss of experienced NCOs and junior officers was particularly devastating, as these men possessed the tactical knowledge and leadership skills that enabled German units to fight effectively despite material disadvantages. Each casualty represented not just an individual tragedy but also the degradation of organizational competence that had sustained Wehrmacht operations throughout the war. The psychological impact of strategic encirclement was becoming evident among German forces as the reality of their situation penetrated the consciousness of officers and enlisted men alike. Soldiers who had spent 3 years advancing across thousands of kilometers of enemy territory now found themselves trapped in an area that could be measured in hundreds of square kilometers, fighting with their backs to the sea against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing day. The confidence and aggressive spirit that had characterized Wehrmacht tactical doctrine was being replaced by the defensive mentality of troops who understood that they were fighting for survival rather than victory. Yet morale remained surprisingly high among veteran units, sustained by professional pride and the bonds of unit cohesion that had been forged through years of shared hardship. The establishment of defensive positions along the perimeter of what was already being called the Courland Pocket proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterized German military engineering. Wehrmacht troops who had learned their trade during 3 years of mobile warfare adapted quickly to the requirements of static defense, constructing fortifications that took advantage of favorable terrain while providing mutual support between adjacent positions. The defensive line that emerged reflected both the tactical competence of German military engineers and the bitter experience that had been gained through years of warfare against Soviet forces. Each position was designed to channel enemy attacks into killing zones where concentrated fire could maximize casualties while conserving ammunition. The final Soviet assault that completed the encirclement of Army Group North began on the morning of July 15 with an artillery preparation that exceeded anything German forces had previously experienced during the Baltic campaign. The barrage continued for 2 hours, systematically targeting German communication centers, supply depots, and troop concentrations with the methodical precision that characterized Red Army fire support doctrine. The weight and accuracy of the bombardment demonstrated that Soviet forces had committed substantial artillery assets to the operation, understanding that the destruction of Army Group North would free up significant resources for deployment to other fronts. The psychological impact of the barrage was almost as important as its material effects, serving notice that the Wehrmacht was facing an enemy with unlimited capacity to sustain firepower. When the Soviet ground assault began at 1030 hours, it came with the overwhelming force that characterized Red Army operations in the fourth year of the war. Tank columns advanced in regimental strength along multiple axes, their T-34s and Stalin tanks supported by self-propelled artillery and followed by waves of infantry that seemed to emerge endlessly from the Estonian forests. The attack was being conducted by elements of the Leningrad Front reinforced with units transferred from other sectors, creating a concentration of combat power that exceeded German defensive capabilities by factors that could not be overcome through tactical skill alone. The Wehrmacht forces defending the approaches to the Courland Peninsula fought with desperate courage, but the mathematical reality was inescapable. Major Bauer's reconnaissance battalion, positioned to cover the northern approaches to the German perimeter, found itself engaged in the most intense combat of the entire war as Soviet forces concentrated their attack against the positions his men had prepared during the previous week. The fighting developed into the kind of close-quarters combat that characterized warfare between veteran forces, with tactical advantage shifting repeatedly as individual squads and platoons maneuvered for position among the forests and swamps that define the battlefield. The reconnaissance troops fought with the aggressive competence that had made them elite soldiers, but they were facing opponents who had learned to fight with equal skill while possessing overwhelming advantages in numbers and supporting firepower. The breakthrough came at 1,347 hours when Soviet combat engineers succeeded in reducing the anti-tank obstacles that protected the eastern approaches to German positions. A battalion of Stalin tanks exploited the gap immediately, their 122mm guns destroying German defensive positions while supporting infantry advanced through the communication trenches that connected Wehrmacht fortifications. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as German anti-tank weapons were overwhelmed by the number of targets, and Soviet infantry began eliminating individual fighting positions with grenades and submachine guns. The reconnaissance battalion fought with desperate courage, but the mathematical reality was inescapable. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy whose capacity to sustain the attack exceeded German ability to resist. The tactical withdrawal that began at 1,415 hours represented the final collapse of German defensive positions along the eastern perimeter of what would become the Courland Pocket. Wehrmacht units conducted fighting withdrawals with the professional competence that had characterized their operations throughout the war, but they were retreating into an area that grew smaller with each passing hour as Soviet forces tightened their encirclement. The reconnaissance battalion led the movement, using their superior knowledge of local terrain to identify routes that would minimize casualties while preserving tactical cohesion. Behind them, the infantry regiments that had formed the backbone of German resistance conducted delaying actions designed to slow the Soviet advance and prevent the development of a complete tactical collapse. The strategic reality that became apparent during the afternoon of July 15th was that Army Group North had ceased to exist as an effective military formation. Soviet forces had achieved complete encirclement of German positions, trapping approximately 200,000 Wehrmacht personnel in an area roughly 30 kilometers wide and 60 kilometers long. The Courland Peninsula had become a vast prison camp surrounded by water on three sides and by victorious Soviet armies on the fourth. Communication with German forces outside the pocket had been severed, and the Wehrmacht units trapped inside faced the choice between fighting until their ammunition was exhausted or attempting surrender to an enemy that had little reason to show mercy. The human dimension of strategic encirclement became apparent as German forces established their final defensive positions along the shores of the Baltic Sea. Soldiers who had spent 3 years advancing eastward across the vastness of the Soviet Union now found themselves compressed into defensive positions that could be measured in hundreds rather than thousands of meters. The psychological impact was profound, as veteran troops struggled to adapt to the claustrophobic reality of siege warfare after years of mobile operations across open terrain. Yet the professional ethos that had sustained Wehrmacht units throughout the war remained intact, expressed now through meticulous preparation of defensive positions and careful conservation of ammunition and supplies. The logistics of survival in the Courland pocket required mathematical precision that exceeded the capabilities of normal military supply systems. German forces consumed approximately 500 tons of ammunition, fuel, and food per day, but the Wehrmacht possessed neither the shipping nor the secure ports necessary to sustain such deliveries under combat conditions. The Baltic Sea had become a Soviet-controlled waterway, patrolled by submarines and surface vessels that made maritime operations prohibitively dangerous. Air transport was limited to emergency evacuation of critical personnel and could not provide the bulk supplies necessary to sustain prolonged resistance. The German forces trapped in the Courland Peninsula were fighting with finite resources against an enemy whose supply lines stretched uninterrupted back to the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union. Major Bauer established his final command post in a concrete bunker that had been constructed by Soviet forces during their occupation of Latvia before the German invasion. The irony was not lost on him that he was now using Soviet fortifications to defend against Soviet attack, a tactical situation that reflected the complete reversal of strategic fortune that had overtaken German forces since the confident days of 1941. The bunker provided protection against artillery fire and close air support, but it also served as a symbol of encirclement and ultimate helplessness. The men of his reconnaissance battalion had gone from being the spearhead of German advance to being trapped defenders fighting with their backs to the sea. The final phase of the battle for the Courland Peninsula began on the evening of July 15 as Soviet forces launched coordinated attacks against German positions along the entire perimeter of the pocket. The assaults came with the methodical precision that characterized Red Army operations, each attack supported by massive artillery preparations and close air support that turned German defensive positions into lunar landscapes of shell craters and destroyed equipment. The Wehrmacht forces defending the pocket fought with the professional competence that had made them the most feared soldiers in Europe, but they were facing an enemy that possessed overwhelming advantages in every category of military power. The reconnaissance reports that continued to arrive throughout the night painted a picture of systematic collapse that could not be concealed by tactical euphemisms about strategic adjustments and fighting withdrawals. Soviet forces had achieved breakthrough in multiple sectors, and German reserves were insufficient to seal the gaps or restore tactical coherence to the defensive perimeter. The mathematical reality was stark and unforgiving. Wehrmacht forces in the Courland Peninsula were outnumbered 10-1 in infantry, 15-1 in artillery, and 20-1 in armored vehicles. Even more critically, Soviet air superiority had reached the point where German positions were under constant attack from fighter bombers and ground attack aircraft that operated with virtual impunity. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich's final report, transmitted by radio during the early morning hours of July 16, provided confirmation of what every German officer in the Courland Peninsula had understood but hoped to avoid. Infantry regiment combat effectiveness has been reduced to approximately company strength. Ammunition reserves are sufficient for one major engagement only. Artillery support is no longer available due to destruction of gun positions and exhaustion of ammunition supplies. Request immediate evacuation authorization for remaining personnel. The message was received by Army Group Headquarters, but no response was forthcoming. The Wehrmacht High Command had already written off the forces trapped in the Courland Peninsula, concentrating available resources on the defense of East Prussia and the approaches to Berlin. The final Soviet assault began at 0545 hours on July 16 with an artillery preparation that exceeded anything German forces had experienced during 4 years of warfare. The barrage continued for 3 hours, systematically destroying the defensive positions that Wehrmacht engineers had constructed during the previous week. When the ground attack began, it came with overwhelming force that made tactical resistance impossible. Soviet infantry advanced in division strength, supported by hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns that methodically eliminated German strong points while maintaining steady pressure along the entire perimeter of the pocket. Major Bauer's reconnaissance battalion made its final stand in positions overlooking the Baltic Sea, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted and then attempting to destroy their equipment to prevent its capture by Soviet forces. The men who had served as the eyes and ears of Army Group North for 3 years fought with the desperate courage of soldiers who understood that they were witnessing the end of their world. When the position was finally overrun at 1,347 hours, Bauer was among the 37 survivors of a unit that had begun the day with more than 200 men. The Courland pocket had claimed another victim in the systematic destruction of Army Group North. The strategic implications of the German defeat in the Baltic states extended far beyond the immediate loss of 200,000 Wehrmacht personnel. The collapse of Army Group North represented the failure of Hitler's fundamental assumption that the Soviet Union could be defeated through rapid offensive operations that would destroy the Red Army before Soviet industry could be fully mobilized for war. Instead, the Wehrmacht had become trapped in a war of attrition against an enemy whose capacity to sustain casualties and replace equipment far exceeded German capabilities. The tactical excellence that had carried German forces to the gates of Moscow and Leningrad was no longer sufficient to overcome the material disadvantages that had accumulated through 4 years of strategic miscalculation. The human cost of strategic failure was measured not just in military casualties but in the civilian populations that had been caught between contending armies throughout the Baltic states. Estonian and Latvian civilians who had initially welcomed German forces as liberators from Soviet occupation now faced the return of Red Army control with the knowledge that collaboration with Wehrmacht forces would be punished with deportation or execution. The war had devastated their homeland, destroying cities and infrastructure while consuming the agricultural production that sustained civilian life. The liberation that many had hoped for had become another form of occupation, and the freedom they had sought remained as distant as ever. The final chapter of the Courland Peninsula campaign was written not in tactical victory or defeat, but in the statistics that recorded the systematic destruction of Army Group North. Of the approximately 200,000 German soldiers who had been trapped in the pocket, fewer than 20,000 survived to see the end of the war. Some died in combat during the final Soviet assaults, others succumbed to disease and starvation during the siege, and many simply vanished into the vast archipelago of Soviet prison camps that stretched across Siberia and Central Asia. The reconnaissance battalion that Major Bauer had commanded was reduced to a handful of survivors who would spend the next decade in Soviet captivity, learning to survive in conditions that made the Courland Peninsula seem comfortable by comparison. The legacy of the Courland Peninsula would be preserved not in official histories or strategic analyses, but in the memories of the few men who had survived to tell the story of Army Group North's final stand. They would remember the professional competence that had sustained Wehrmacht operations even under impossible circumstances, the tactical excellence that had enabled German forces to inflict disproportionate casualties on their Soviet opponents, and the human courage that had motivated soldiers to continue fighting long after any rational hope of victory had disappeared. But they would also remember the strategic blindness that had led Germany into a war that could not be won, the ideological fanaticism that had prevented negotiated settlement when such settlement was still possible, and the ultimate futility of tactical excellence in service of strategic impossibility. The ice roads that had connected the Courland Peninsula to the rest of Latvia during the winter months would never again carry German supplies or reinforcements. The Baltic Sea had become a Soviet lake, and the Wehrmacht forces that had once advanced with confident precision across thousands of kilometers of enemy territory had been reduced to a handful of survivors who would carry the memory of their comrades into an uncertain future. The Courland Peninsula had become more than a geographic location. It had become a symbol of the price that soldiers paid when political leaders chose war over wisdom and ideology over reality. In the end, the men of Army Group North had fought with courage and died with honor, but they had been betrayed by a strategic vision that valued conquest over human life and tactical brilliance over strategic common sense.